There are stories that fade with time, and then there are those that refuse to be silenced. They linger in the quiet of memorials, in the pages of history books, and in the DNA of our modern world. They are ghosts, whispering warnings across the decades. No story haunts our collective consciousness quite like the Second World War. It was not a single narrative, but a million stories woven into a tapestry of unparalleled courage and unspeakable cruelty. It was a global firestorm that consumed continents, a laboratory for human nature at its best and very worst. Even now, 8 decades later, its shadow stretches long over our politics, our borders, our fears, and our hopes. This is the story of that war. Not just the story of how it was fought, but of why it still matters. This is the war story that still haunts the world. The ghost of World War II was born in the uneasy silence that followed World War I. The war to end all wars had concluded, but its peace was a fragile, wounded thing. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was less a peace treaty and more a document of punishment for Germany. It carved up empires, imposed crippling financial reparations, and forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war. This war guilt clause was a poison pill for the German people. Their national pride was shattered, their economy in ruins, their political landscape a chaotic battleground of extremists. In the beer halls of Munich, a former corporal and failed artist named Adolf Hitler found his voice. He channeled this national humiliation into a message of venomous blame, pointing the finger at Jews, communists, and liberals for stabbing the undefeated German army in the back. His National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, offered not just recovery, but resurrection through scapegoating and ultra-nationalism. Across the globe, other powers were also stirring. In Italy, the fascist Benito Mussolini seized power, promising to restore the glory of the Roman Empire through force and discipline. In the Far East, Japan, a rapidly modernizing island nation with limited resources, watched with growing anxiety and ambition. Its military, increasingly acting independently of the civilian government, saw expansion onto the Asian mainland as a matter of national survival. In 1931, the Kwantung Army invaded and seized the Chinese region of Manchuria, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations, the world's fledgling peacekeeping body, issued a condemnation, but took no concrete action. This failure was a signal to aggressors everywhere. It was the first crack in the foundation of global order, a warning unheeded. The world, weary of war, chose to look away, hoping the storm would pass, but the storm was only gathering. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. He moved with terrifying speed to dismantle democracy, establishing a totalitarian state. He rebuilt the German military in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty, and the world did nothing. In 1936, he marched troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. Again, France and Britain protested, but took no action. The policy of appeasement was born from a desperate, understandable desire to avoid another catastrophic war. But to a dictator, appeasement looks like weakness. In 1938, Hitler annexed his native Austria in the Anschluss, and the world barely flinched. Then he turned his gaze to the Sudetenland, the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. The climax of appeasement came in September 1938 in Munich. The leaders of Britain, France, and Italy, without consulting Czechoslovakia, agreed to hand the Sudetenland over to Hitler. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London, waving a piece of paper and declaring he had secured peace for our time. He was tragically mistaken. He had merely convinced Hitler that the democracies were weak and would always back down. In March 1939, Hitler swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia. The illusion shattered. Britain and France finally drew a line, guaranteeing the independence of Poland. But it was too late. Hitler, confident of their impotence, had already set his sights east. To ensure he would not face a two-front war, he orchestrated the most shocking diplomatic move of the century. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological archenemies, signed a non-aggression pact. In a secret protocol, they agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland was to be partitioned once again. The stage was set for catastrophe. Just before dawn on September 1, 1939, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on a Polish military depot at Westerplatte. The first shots of World War II had been fired. 2 days later, honoring their pledge, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world held its breath, waiting for the clash of titans. What came instead was a new kind of warfare, a lightning strike that would change the face of battle forever. The invasion of Poland was not the slow, grinding warfare of the past. It was blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was a sledgehammer blow of coordinated force. First, screaming Stuka dive bombers shattered communication lines and morale. Then, fast-moving panzer divisions punched through defensive lines, bypassing strongpoints. Finally, mechanized infantry mopped up the encircled, disoriented enemy. Poland, brave but hopelessly outmatched, was crushed in weeks. From the east, the Soviet Red Army, as per its pact with Hitler, invaded, sealing Poland's fate. The country was erased from the map, but its government and many of its soldiers fled to continue the fight from exile. In the West, an eerie, phony war settled over the front lines for 8 months. Then, in the spring of 1940, the lightning struck again. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. The main blow fell on May 10th. The assault did not come through the heavily fortified French Maginot Line, but through the dense, unimpassable Ardennes forest. It was a masterstroke of tactical surprise. German panzers emerged behind the main Allied armies and raced for the English Channel, trapping the British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army at the sea at Dunkirk. What followed was a miracle born of desperation. Operation Dynamo. A flotilla of naval ships and hundreds of civil little ships evacuated over 338,000 soldiers from the beaches under fire. It was a defeat, but it saved an army. Days later, France fell. Now, Britain stood alone. The new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, offered his people no promises of easy victory, only blood, toil, tears, and sweat. The next battle would be fought in the skies over England. The Battle of England was a duel between the pilots of the RAF and the vast fleets of the Luftwaffe. The British had radar and the superb Spitfires and Hurricane fighters. The pilots, the few, were young men from across the British Empire and occupied Europe. They lived a life of intense tension, scrambled multiple times a day to face death. When the Germans shifted from bombing airfields to bombing London and other cities, the Blitz, they gave the RAF a crucial respite. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe had been beaten back. Britain had held. The island fortress had weathered the storm, but the war was about to expand into a truly global conflagration. Even as the Blitz rained down on London, Hitler was planning his most ambitious and fateful campaign. On June 22, 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in human history, involving over 3 million Axis troops. Stalin, despite numerous warnings, was caught completely by surprise.
The Red Army was devastated in the initial onslaught, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers captured. But this was not just a military campaign. It was a war of annihilation. Following the Nazi ideology, the rules of war were discarded. Behind the front lines, SS Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, began the systematic massacre of Jews, communists, and Slavic peoples. The war on the Eastern Front was, from its inception, a descent into a depth of barbarism the world had never seen. As the German advance slowed before the gates of Moscow, battered by the brutal Russian winter, another event transformed the conflict. On December 7, 1941, a date which would live in infamy, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise aerial attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The goal was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and remove American influence from the Pacific and Asia. In a devastating 2-hour assault, 8 battleships were damaged or sunk, and over 2,400 Americans were killed. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Honoring their tripartite pact, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The industrial and human might of America was now fully committed to the Allied cause. The war was no longer a European conflict. It was a world war. Japan followed Pearl Harbor with a lightning campaign of conquest. They invaded the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The fall of Singapore, a British fortress once considered impregnable, was a humiliating disaster. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces, under General Douglas MacArthur, fought a desperate delaying action on the Bataan Peninsula. After a grueling siege, they were forced to surrender. What followed was the Bataan Death March, a 65-mile forced march of some 80,000 prisoners of war. Denied food, water, and medical care, and subjected to random beatings and bayonettings, thousands perished. It was a stark introduction to the brutal nature of the war in the Pacific, a theater where surrender was often seen as a disgrace by the Japanese military. By the middle of 1942, the Axis powers were at the zenith of their conquests. But this was the high water mark. Across the globe, the Allies began to stem the tide. In the Pacific, the U.S. Navy achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Midway. American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese plans, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to set a trap. In an engagement fought entirely by aircraft from carriers that never saw each other, U.S. dive bombers sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. It was a devastating, irreversible blow. The initiative in the Pacific had passed to the United States. But the true titanic struggle was in the East. Hitler's 1942 summer offensive aimed at the oil field of the Caucasus. The key to this advance was the city on the Volga that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. What followed was not a battle for a city, but for its ruins. The German 6th Army fought its way in, but the Soviet 62nd Army under General Vasily Trikov refused to surrender. They fought for every factory, every house, every room. The life expectancy of a newly arrived Soviet soldier was less than 24 hours. It was a meat grinder of unimaginable ferocity. As the German 6th Army was bled white in the urban nightmare, the Soviet High Command prepared a masterstroke. In Operation Uranus, launched in November 1942, massive Soviet forces smashed through the weaker Romanian armies guarding the German flanks. Within days, the pincers met, trapping over 250,000 Axis soldiers. Hitler forbade a breakout, promising the Luftwaffe would supply them by air, a promise it could not keep. Through the bitter winter, the 6th Army slowly starved and froze. On February 2, 1943, the last remnants surrendered. It was a catastrophic defeat from which the German war machine in the East never recovered. The ghost of Stalingrad would haunt the Wehrmacht for the rest of the war. In North Africa, the tide also turned. At the remote Egyptian railway halt of El Alamein, the British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery finally stopped the legendary German commander Erwin Rommel. In late October 1942, after a massive buildup, Montgomery launched his offensive. The battle was a brutal, set-piece engagement of attrition. The fighting was fierce, but the British, with superior numbers and supplies, gradually wore down the Afrika Korps. As Montgomery pushed from the east, a new Anglo-American force landed in Operation Torch in French North Africa. They then drove east, squeezing the Axis in a giant vice. By May 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa had surrendered. The soft underbelly of Europe was now exposed. The Allies had their first major victory on land, and the road to Sicily and Italy lay open. While the armies clashed on the front lines, a different, more insidious war was being waged in the shadows. This was the war against the innocent, the systematic murder of millions deemed unworthy of life by the Nazi regime. The Holocaust was not an accidental byproduct of the war. It was its ideological core. What began with discriminatory laws in 1933, like the Nuremberg Laws, escalated to violent pogroms like Kristallnacht in 1938, and finally evolved into a state-sponsored industrial process of mass murder during the war. The final solution to the Jewish question was formally coordinated at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. But the machinery of death was already in motion. Jews from across Europe were first forced into overcrowded, disease-ridden ghettos like the one in Warsaw, where they slowly starved. Then they were told they were being resettled in the East. They were packed into cattle cars with no food, water, or sanitation. The journey itself was a form of torture. Those who survived arrived at places whose names would become synonymous with evil: Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Chelmno. At camps like Auschwitz, a selection took place. An SS doctor with a flick of the wrist decided who was fit for slave labor and who would die immediately.
The elderly, the sick, women, and children were told they were going to the showers for disinfection. They were herded into large underground chambers disguised as shower rooms. The doors were sealed, and Zyklon B pesticide crystals were dropped in. Within 20 minutes, hundreds of lives were extinguished. Their bodies were then looted for gold teeth, hair, and any valuables and burned in industrial crematoria. The scale, the cold efficiency, and the bureaucratic nature of the slaughter was unprecedented. It was the factory applied to death. Yet even in this absolute darkness, the human spirit refused to be completely extinguished. There was resistance. In the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, a handful of young Jews, armed with little more than pistols and Molotov cocktails, rose up against the German army. They held out for nearly a month, fighting from sewer to attic. They knew they could not win, but they chose to die on their feet, with dignity. The Holocaust was not only against the Jews. The Nazis also systematically murdered millions of Roma and Sinti people, Slavs, people with physical and mental disabilities, and political dissidents. By the war's end, the Nazis and their collaborators had murdered approximately 6 million Jews and at least 5 million others. The liberation of the camps by Allied soldiers in the final months of the war revealed the full, sickening horror to a disbelieving world. The skeletal survivors, the piles of corpses, the smell of death, these images were seared into the consciousness of humanity, a permanent scar and a warning for all time. This is the ghost that haunts us most of all. By 1944, the Allies were closing the vice on the Third Reich from all sides. The Great Crusade, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe, was launched on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Operation Overlord was the most complex military operation ever conceived. Under the overall command of American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a vast armada crossed the English Channel. At Omaha Beach, American forces faced a nightmare, cut down by withering German fire as they landed. Through sheer courage and determination, they secured a foothold. After weeks of brutal fighting in the Normandy hedgerows, the Allies broke out and began the liberation of Europe. Paris was freed on August 25, 1944, a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. As the Allies pushed from the west, the Soviet Union launched its own massive offensives from the east, pushing the Germans back across a 1,000-mile front in a relentless, bloody advance. The final battle for Berlin was an apocalyptic spectacle. In April 1945, over 2 million Soviet soldiers assaulted the German capital.
The fighting was house to house, room to room. In his bunker deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, a delusional Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. VE Day was celebrated, but the celebrations were tempered by the immense cost and the grim revelations of the concentration camps. The war in the Pacific, however, raged on with undiminished ferocity. The American island-hopping campaign had brought U.S. forces ever closer to the Japanese home islands. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were bloodbaths, demonstrating the fanatical resistance the Japanese would put up to a homeland invasion. Kamikaze pilots crashed their planes into Allied ships in desperate suicide attacks. The cost was projected to be catastrophic, up to 1 million Allied casualties and countless Japanese. It was against this grim backdrop that a new, terrifying weapon was completed. The top-secret Manhattan Project had succeeded in harnessing the power of the atom. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy on the city of Hiroshima. The city was obliterated in a single, sun-bright flash. An estimated 70,000 people were killed instantly. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Another 40,000 perished. The world had witnessed a power that could end all worlds. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. The formal surrender was signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The war was finally, tragically, over. The silence that fell in 1945 was the silence of the exhausted and the mourning. The numbers were so vast they became abstractions, but behind each number was a human life. Approximately 70 to 85 million people dead, representing about 3% of the world's population. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million. Poland lost nearly 1/5 of its entire pre-war population. The scale of the slaughter was and remains incomprehensible. Cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins. Millions were displaced, homeless, starving. This was the price of the war. The world that emerged from the rubble was fundamentally and irrevocably changed. Europe, the center of global power for centuries, was broken and bankrupt. Its empires in Asia and Africa, weakened and discredited, would soon dissolve in the wave of decolonization that followed. The continent was now divided by an iron curtain, as Churchill termed it. The Soviet Union dominated Eastern Europe, installing communist puppet governments. The United States emerged as the leader of the democratic West. The wartime alliance between the capitalist democracies and the communist Soviet Union shattered, giving way to a new, tense conflict, the Cold War. This would be a decades-long struggle for global supremacy, fought with proxies, espionage, and the terrifying threat of nuclear annihilation, a direct haunting legacy of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the ashes of the Holocaust, the world was shamed into action. The Nuremberg and Tokyo war crimes trials established a new principle in international law, that individuals, even heads of state, could be held accountable for crimes against peace, war crimes, and the newly defined crimes against humanity. The phrase, "I was just following orders," was rejected as a defense. To ensure such a catastrophe could never happen again, the United Nations was founded in 1945, with the paramount goal of maintaining international peace and security. It was a vessel for a fragile hope. The war also catalyzed profound social changes. It accelerated the fight for civil rights in the United States as African American soldiers who had fought against tyranny abroad returned to fight against segregation at home. For women who had kept the factories running and served in auxiliary military roles in unprecedented numbers, the war had proven their capabilities, irrevocably changing gender roles and paving the way for greater social and economic independence. The war story that still haunts the world is not just a tale of battles and dates. It is a story about the fragility of civilization and the ease with which hatred and nationalism can be weaponized. It is a story about the capacity for both unimaginable courage and unspeakable evil that resides within humanity. The ghosts of the fallen soldiers, the murdered millions, the shattered cities, they are a permanent part of our world's memory. They haunt us not to paralyze us with grief, but to compel us with responsibility. They are a warning, a lesson carved into the stone of history that peace is not a default state, but a conscious, continuous achievement. That vigilance against hatred, against the dehumanization of the other, is the price we must pay to ensure that such a story is never repeated. This is the legacy. This is the haunting. And this is the lesson we must carry forward for as long as memory endures.